Hey everybody, I wanted to give you a couple of study tips for biology. And it doesn't really matter what kind of biology you're talking about. It could be microbiology or intro bio or even A&P. All the steps of learning would be the same. So I want to talk a little bit about the steps of learning. Imagine coming into a class on the first day and the professor stands up and she starts talking and you are completely lost. You don't know what she's talking about. This would be the first step of learning. So you're a little bit confused. You're not sure what's important. You're not sure, is everything in the notes going to be on the test? Just some things? How do I figure it out? So many students coming into class feel this way. You are not alone if you feel this way. And anytime you start a new concept, you can feel overwhelmed and lost. So if you don't know what's expected or you don't know what to do, that's okay. That's the beginning of learning, and it's completely normal. Perhaps by listening during lecture or watching a video, you can move to step 2. Now, step 2 is where you have some pretty good understanding. You can follow along with the explanations in class, and you can solve some easy questions, but you don't really have such a great understanding of how this information relates to other topics that might come after it or topics that came before it. One way that you could maybe get to the next step would be working on worksheets or going to SI sessions. This gives you some confidence and gives you more ability to solve questions. However, even on step 3, you might be thinking to yourself, ooh, I don't quite have all the vocab, and sometimes when someone asks me a question, I can't remember exactly what that word means. So step 3 is not the top. Step 4 would be where you become a master of the material. So this is where if I called you out in class, you'd be able to explain it to me or explain it to your fellow students without any notes, without prompts. You have a deep understanding of the entire topic. So the unfortunate thing is that most students stop at step 2. So they feel pretty confident because when the professor is lecturing and they have their notes in front of them, they understand what's going on. The problem is on the exam, you're not going to have your notes in front of you and you don't have someone there explaining it to you. So the real trick is to get from step 2 to step 4. I often find that these steps correlate to grades at the end of the semester. So a student who's really mastered the information, who can explain things to other people, are on a step 4, usually get an A. Students that are pretty confident but have missed some of the vocab, they might make silly mistakes on the exam just because they don't quite really get the meaning of a word. They're usually on step 3 and would get somewhere around a B. A student that is on step 2 who follows along during class and gets a lot of the material but can't really explain it to somebody else and requires their notes to be in front of them to do worksheet problems, that student would be on a step 2 and would probably get somewhere around a C. And then if you really never got to step 2, you would get a grade below a C. So the question becomes, how do you get from one step to another? Maybe it seems like too much, but it's not magic. People who make it to all the way to step 4, I'll call it the A step, study differently than students who tend to stay at step 2. Let me show you what they do. This is a visual that was put together after doing some education research, and this was not in biology, this was research in another field. But what the researchers found out is that if you have students sit and listen to a lecture and then ask them about the material a week later, if they listen to the lecture, they retain about 5% of the material. So not so great. If you have students either read their textbooks or read over their notes and then test them a week later on the material, they only retain about 10% of that material. So if you are spending your time coming to lecture and listening and then reading over your notes, you're really only going to be able to retain about 15% of that material a week later. The next slice on the pyramid would be audiovisual. This would be something like watching a movie that has audio and it has some kind of interesting effects. Again, not a huge bang for your buck. You're only going to remember about 20% of that movie a week later. A little bit higher up in the bang for buck category is the next slice, the demonstration slice. This would be if you were listening to some kind of demonstration, you're asking questions, maybe you're participating, but you're being told what to do and why you're doing it. Again, not a great bang for buck here because you're only going to remember about 30% of that after a week. Where we really want to get to is the bottom 3 slices of this pyramid. This is what we call active learning. This is different than the first 4 slices because in the first 4 slices you're just sitting passively. You're listening, maybe you're reading some things that other people have written or watching a movie, but you're not actually doing anything. You're not working with the material yourself. So one of the best ways to work with material would be in a discussion group. So this is where you are working on problem sets. This is where you are talking to your peers, trying to work through problems, trying to talk to each other about the material. The next one down would be practicing by doing. This is when you are spending your time deciding which are the terms that you need to know for vocabulary and writing out your flashcards. This is where you're organizing your notes, maybe not just rewriting them, but looking at them, closing your notebook and trying to write them over from memory. This is where you might be working on worksheets or making charts or trying to put things in order to remember them. The gold standard is teaching others. So if you teach your fellow classmates about the information, you will remember almost 90% of that information a week later. So that's the best bang for your buck. You can actually do that in a discussion group. So when you're in a discussion group and you know the topic, or you have a good idea of the topic, always try to teach somebody else. That'll give you a really, really good recall. I can present to you kind of a tool belt of active learning strategies that you can use. Most people do the red and the blue ones, the one at the top and the one at the bottom. So they tend to rewrite or review their lecture notes and they read their textbook. However, remember, writing and rewriting your lecture notes only gave you about 10% recall a week later. So even though it's good to review your lecture notes, it's not going to give you the biggest bang for the buck out of all of these strategies. Flashcards are really important. Determining which words are important, determining which words you know and which words you don't know, that's going to fall into that active learning category. Other things that you can do. Take your flashcards, take the words that you're trying to learn and your vocabulary and do word analysis. If you have a word like disaccharide, break it into di and saccharide. Di means 2, saccharide means sugar. So you can remember very easily that a disaccharide is 2 monomers put together. That's what I mean by word analysis. Another great strategy is a graphic representation. And this is when, if you have a process where one thing happens and the next thing happens, you can make a flowchart, writing out each of the steps with some information about each step. You can do a concept map to see how lots of different concepts relate to one another. Sometimes I'll give you some review questions, but it's always really good to create your own review questions. See what you think is important in the notes or the textbook, and then compare to what your professor gives you. Another great strategy, again, is the discussion group. This is where you can do your practice problems. This might be something like your SI sessions, and this gives you hands-on active learning opportunities to work with the material. Again, the gold star is teaching others, and it doesn't have to be somebody that's in your discussion group or somebody that's in class. You can teach your parents, teach your best friend, tell them what you're learning in biology, and explain to them how it's so cool. These are ways you can get from one step to another. So if you're on step 1, you have to start at the beginning. You have to understand the material before you can move on. So this is where you're going to be reading your textbook. You're going to be listening to the lecture. You're going to be learning. You're going to be watching videos, maybe YouTube videos, maybe the videos I make for you in class. And you're going to go to the SI session. This is going to give you that basic understanding that you need to start climbing up the learning steps. If you're on step 2, this is when you want to start memorizing vocabulary. You want to get away from your notes pretty soon. So you're going to be making mnemonics where you can take steps in a process and remember the first letter of each one to help you remember the order. This is where you're going to start working on problem sets, reviewing your notes and reorganizing them so they make more sense. You're going to be making flowcharts and numbered steps. Again, going to SI is very valuable at this step. If you've made it to step 3, that's great. Now you need to move away from your notes. Close that notebook. Close that textbook. Go to study group and do the review questions with no notes. Teach somebody else and come to SI. If you've made it to step 4, that means you are the master. If I asked you, you could tell me how it works. No notes and no prompts. If you're at step 4, you got it. Thanks for listening. See you in class.